Hello everyone. In today's video we're going to go over stopping CyFlex programs. There's plenty of programs that you'll just launch in the Go script and then they will run until you kill all of CyFlex with the slay stuff command. But there's plenty of other programs that you may end up needing to stop and start in various circumstances. And so we're going to kind of go over that. I've got a bunch of different examples. Mostly we're going to be talking about Gmodbus in this particular video. It's just an arbitrary program to use an example, but it is a program that I would say that, especially whenever you're writing your Gmodbus file for the first time, you're going to be starting and stopping it manually. But it's also something that, oftentimes you're talking Gmodbus to a smart device that maybe isn't always in the test cell or isn't always connected. And so it's good practice to not start programs if the device isn't there, if they're communicating, or to stop them whenever you're removing that. So these are just some different examples of different levels of thoroughness for stopping a program. And the qualifier I'll put on this is that a lot of this is going to be generic bash functions and commands. I'm mostly self-taught on bash scripting. I've used the internet, which is a great resource for learning bash. But some of you watching this may know better than me and have a better idea. So if so, go ahead and comment on the video and share your great ideas with the world, or make fun of me, whatever. Alright, so yeah, we're here in Visual Studio Code. We're going to look through some different examples of ways that you can stop Gmodbus. So on my system, I've got a few different Gmodbus related programs running, we can say. I don't currently have the one for this, so I'm going to run another script I have, start Gantt Gmod. This is a start script that's going to start the instance of Gmodbus that's talking to my Q station, and then show me what the values are at the end. So now if I run send -p gmod, I've got this other instance running that I call gmodbus.ganttner. And then here you see the registered name, which is gmod_gantt. And the registered name you'll actually only see on the spawned process gmodbus child, not on gmodbus, but if you release this registered name, it will release both. So, okay, so what are some ways to stop this program? Here's one that you should never do. This is called stop Gantt Gmod never, because you should never do it. So the problem with this, the slay command, if you're new to CyFlex, the slay command is a command that you can use to slay CyFlex processes. So if I do a send -p on Flogger, for example, I've got these two instances of Flogger running. So let's say I want to slay this particular one. I can do a slay -f Flogger. Now I've got no floggers running. The problem with this is you're going to slay all Gmodbus programs. And as we saw here, I've got two instances of Gmodbus. If your goal is to eliminate all Gmodbus instances, then that's maybe okay. Still not ideal, I would say. But the -f is the force. So if I relaunch this program, and then I were to say, so send -p Flogger so that we can see that it's running. Now if I just say slay Flogger from the command line, it's going to ask me, yes or no, do you want to kill this particular PID, this instance of Flogger? I'm going to say no for now. But the -f says don't ask questions, just kill every program. That is the argument that you give it. So this is what you should never do. Moving up in thoroughness, we get to this one. So this is stop Gantt Gmod. These are all just random names I came up with. The naming doesn't necessarily matter. But here we're using a command called isNameReady. So we can do a which on that, and we'll see that it's a CyFlex program, lives in CyFlex bin. So what we're doing here, if we run isNameReady, is a very useful program for doing exactly what it's doing here. So send -p gmod _ Gantt. We see that there's an instance of gmodbus child running called gmod Gantt. If I run use on isNameReady, it's going to tell us how to use it. And so you're going to give it the registered name, and you can specify a wait time if you like. I rarely do. And so here's the explanation that you need to give it a registered name, not a program name. So you wouldn't run isNameReady gmodbus. You would run isNameReady gmod _ Gantt. So if I run isNameReady gmod Gantt, it instantly returns. So, and then I can do echo, and it instantly returns a 1. So isNameReady will return 1 if the registered name that you give it as arg1 is running. So if I run the same command, but I just put nonsense in here, you're going to see it hang for 1 second. It by default checks up to 1 second for the registered name that you give it. Now, if I look at my bash response of that command, this is the response of the previous command, by the way, if you're not familiar with this bash $?? It tells you success or failure, and success normally is indicated as 0. So, but this command is going to return a 0 whenever it's not running. And so it's just important to either remember what isNameReady returns when it is or isn't running, so that you know how to format your if statement and whether or not to put a not symbol in there. But it's also, I almost never remember. I just do this right here every time, and then I see what it returns, and then I act accordingly. So what this is doing is this is checking to see if it's running before releasing it. Well, what's the point, right? Does it hurt anything to just run release task on something that's not running? And the answer to that, I would say, is kind of. No, it's not going to cause any problems with your system per se, but if I run release task and then just give it garbage, it looks like nothing has happened. But if I then look at my errors, I now get this, what I'm going to call is a nuisance error. I've got something in my error log that says release task was not able to release this. Now, in this particular case, this is garbage, and I could see it, and I could go, well, someone was doing something dumb. But if I'm looking through my error log, and I see all these errors saying release task failed to release gmod Gantt, and I configured my system so I know that gmod Gantt is the registered name for gmodbus with my QStation, I might think that there's a problem with my automated script that's supposed to release this communication because I have errors. So the whole reason I'm doing this here is don't make errors whenever there's not a problem. So don't execute a program that's going to generate errors and then not actually do you any good. So that's why I have this if statement here. If you call this script and this program isn't running, I kind of jumped the gun on that, but you kind of get the point. And the point, since we're here, is there's different release programs. So I never remember what they are. So what I do is I do an ls-ltr on CyFlex bin release star. And here you'll see there's release task. This is the generic release command for CyFlex programs that takes a registered name as the argument. And then there's all these others that are written specifically for certain programs. So statistics has its own release program. Limit has its own release program. You may be asking yourself, why don't all these programs just use release task? I don't know, but at some point someone thought it was a good idea to write 10 instead. So be conscious of the fact that there are special release programs for certain programs. And if there's not a special release program in here, you should use release task. If you're running a program that doesn't have a registered name, first of all, I recommend using a registered name if possible, because sometimes it's optional, like Flogger, Gmodbus. I think Gmodbus it's optional. I'm not sure actually. But some programs it's optional whether or not you put a registered name in there. So I recommend using a registered name so that you can use release task instead of doing terrible things like this. So now let's move on to one that's slightly more thorough than this, which is not this, it's this. So this is doing a little bit more, which is basically the CK I put at the end of here is check. So what this is doing is it's taking what we had before to release the program. We check that it's running. We don't release unless it's running. But then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure it actually released. And this is something that is good practice sometimes. I think you kind of have to evaluate your own use case as to whether or not you want to double check what you did previously to make sure it was successful. Sometimes you can just assume that when you call release task it's going to be successful. There are times where either there are bugs or maybe you've got some problem with your script, I don't know, but sometimes it's good to check and make sure that something released. It might be that the program that you're asking to release takes 5 seconds to release, and then the thing that you're going to do after, you need to have that program released before you do the following step. And if that's the case, it's good to do something like we're doing here. So this little while loop, what we're doing here is we've got our counter, we've got a while loop that says while the counter variable is less than 20, and then once a second we're going to do this. We're going to do an if is name ready on Gmod can't, and so I like to put these comments of if statements because I'm quite forgetful and I don't always remember when I'm coming back to the syntax, and so this little comment basically says if we're inside this part of the if statement, then it hasn't finished releasing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to wait 1 second and then we're going to increment our counter. And so we're going to essentially come to this part of the while loop over and over and over, or sorry, this part of the while loop over and over until it's actually released. Once it's released, then we're going to break. Once we break, we're going to do this final check to verify that, because if we get out of this while loop because of this break statement, then that means it released. But if we get out because our counter equal 20 and it's still running, then we need to notify the user that this stop script failed to do what it was supposed to do. So what we're going to do here is one final check. And then here I'm just creating a string bash variable containing the text that I'm going to pop up. And then I'm using Zenity here. I've switched to Zenity myself from KDialog since we're in Oracle Linux and GNOME, because KDialog was for KDE. You can run it on here, but it's not native, and I prefer to run native programs if possible. So, but if you're familiar with KDialogs, you'll be familiar with this. We're gonna, in the case that it didn't release, we're gonna create this string variable that says there was a problem releasing Gmodbus with this registered name. Please troubleshoot before proceeding. The reason or maybe I should say the use case for me using a Zenity window instead of an echo, is just you have to ask yourself the question, am I going to call this script from the command line 100% of the time? Or am I sometimes going to be calling it from a GP test or from an event response or from an operator display? And then the follow-up question is, if you're calling it from an automated means where you're not going to see the echo, is it important that these messages make it to the user after it's called? So a use case where I would almost always put a Zenity window indicating failure is if it's a command that I expect people are mostly going to be running from an operator display, because then they're going to click the button and I like to notify them after they click the button whether it was successful or whether it was not. So that's kind of an overview of this. So send minus p gmodbus, as we've still got it running. Let's just run this one since it's pretty good. Gant gmod check. So here we get our terminal releasing gmod Gant. It waits for a second, and then it says gmodbus with registered name gmod Gant was successfully released. Great. So now we can do a send minus p on gmodbus. We can see that it's not running. If I run this again, it's going to give me this message saying it was successfully released, and that's because it's not running. We would have still run the release task, or no, we wouldn't have run the release task, but it is still going to go through these steps, and it is still going to indicate success. I was trying to think of how to show the error message, just so you can see the difference, because if you're not familiar with Zenity, then you might not realize that that info message looks different. I think what I can do is just copy and paste all this here. Yeah, so the error message is going to show this red circle indicating that it's not just information, you've got a problem. And here you can see it says proceed, or please troubleshoot before proceeding. So anyway, I actually like to do those whenever I'm running something from a GP test as well. You know, if you're in the middle of a GP test, and especially if you've got the GP test set up so that it's going to hang whenever it gets to this failure mode, the likelihood of someone seeing that pop up versus someone looking at your test description string variable on an operator display, the pop-ups, it just might help. So this is kind of a more thorough way of not only releasing it, but making sure it's released. And then I'm just going to go ahead and say the downside of this is 32 lines of bash scripting to release a program, whenever you could just come from the command line and say release task gmod Gant. It's a lot, and so you may be thinking, wow, that's overkill. Why would I spend that much time writing these release scripts? And you might be right, it might be a waste of time. I don't know. I kind of just like doing it. So here's another example where what I've done is just make it more generic. And so here, instead of saying, instead of hard coding, maybe I can display it like this and it'll be easier. So if I do the generic on the right and the regular one on the left, all we're doing here is replacing all of these hard-coded registered names and application names with bash variables. And I did this using Control F, arrow down. This is your find and replace in VS Code. When I wrote this morning, I used that, and I just changed these to these bash variables. And the advantage of the bash variable, I mean, you can just use find and replace. I think that's generally more dangerous. I tend to screw it up. So instead, if you create these bash variables at the top with your registered name and application name, then you could use this same stop script for compvar, for event response for any CyFlex program that has an app name and a registered name. And it's going to generically have a pop-up that tells you whether or not it was successful or not successful releasing that program. And it's always going to wait up to 20 seconds. And if you wanted to change that, I mean, you could actually, if you really wanted, you could make this time, or let's say wait time. And you could come up here and say wait time equals 20. So, I mean, that's just another example of where you can format these scripts so that you have variables up at the top, and if you want to apply this script to some other program, you just come in, you edit things at the top, and then everything after that you leave alone, and in theory it should work. So I think the only, so I put this noteworthy mention thing just to say there are other ways to kill programs. So I already went over this as far as seeing the special release programs. Flogger is one special example where there's a release event. So with Flogger, you've got your start event and stop event for starting and stopping logging. But if you start and stop logging, Flogger will still be running in the background, and there might be a scenario where you actually want to release it and then restart it. So you can just use this release event, and you can set this event from GPTest, event response, 100 different ways, or you can just use setev from the command line, or you can use setev if you're doing it from within a bash script. We already went over slay and an app name and slay -f. The other one is like a native Linux command, kill -9. You can read the man page on kill to really get a firm understanding of all of the kill arguments. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on it. A software engineer told me that this was the machine gun of killing programs, and that you use it whenever you don't want any remnants of what you've done. So take that for what it's worth. Sometimes you have to use this because slay might fail for some reason, or whatever, but in general, this is not my first go-to, the kill -9 by the PID. And then, yeah, this is somewhat related, somewhat not, but I decided to throw it in here. This is a specific one for waiting for Flogger to write a file. And I just put it in here because to me this is kind of related to this concept of having a while loop where you wait for a program to exit before proceeding. So what we do in this is we wait for an instance of Flogger to finish writing its file before we exit. And so part of the reason I kind of felt like throwing this in here is there's just some nuanced stuff. So one of the things that I'm doing here that I'm not sure a lot of people know that you can do as far as baking something natively into a bash script is you can call getComp, and we've recently, I think last year, added these arguments to getComp where you can say option equals no units. So when you run this command, you're going to, let's just run this command to show you. Now let's run it without that option equals. So essentially what we're doing here is if you're trying to do something natively in a bash script where you don't want this carriage return, you don't want this equals sign, you don't want this space, and you don't want this set of units in brackets, you just want to get the raw value that is returned from a computed expression, you can give this option equals no units. And so, I mean, this option is basically the equivalent of gval versus gvar. So yeah, that's essentially what we're doing here. The reason that it was used here is we were calling this user function at year, month, day, because this is how this Flogger file that I had to write this script for was being used. And here we're creating a function as opposed to just putting it in the script raw. The only reason I kind of like to do this is I like to encapsulate all of this into a file at once. So any echo statement that I put in here will go to this file. And so let's just kind of go through here. Here we've got a comment saying what I'm doing. I recommend putting comments in your scripts. Unless you just like to watch the world burn and you hate your coworkers, people will thank you for doing this one day. Here we've got write time. This is what we're actually going to use as a counter in our while loop, and we're also going to end up writing that to a file just for curiosity's sake, so that we can find out how long it took Flogger to write. This is actually from an automated test that I was creating whenever I was testing Flogger, to see how long it would take to write different types of log files. And I can tell you I think the worst case that I got, I was writing a 20-minute fast logger file. I say fast, 100 hertz logger file with around 1,000 variables, and it took 3 minutes to write the file. The particular scenario that I've seen this play out poorly for customers is when they're trying to write a logger file for doing emissions analysis, and then they run the program that does the analysis on that file while Flogger is still writing that file. As you can imagine, if that logger file doesn't have all the data, that's going to be bad. So you don't want to do that. So here's an example of one way. I'm very confident there's a better way, but this is the way that I did it. Comment better suggestions if you know them. What I'm doing is, in this while loop, I'm going to wait for up to 4 minutes, and I'm going to check the file size, I'm going to wait 1 second, and I'm going to check the file size again. And then I'm going to do a comparison to see if the file size the second time I checked is bigger than the first time I checked. If Flogger is still writing to the data file, then it will be bigger. And you may be wondering, how did I figure this out? I used Google, and I Googled how to determine file size from a script, and it gave me this. I tested it, it worked, I used it. I recommend doing the same. So if this is the case, if it was bigger the second time I checked than the first time I checked, then it's still writing. And so I'm going to say let write time equals write time plus 1. So I'm just going to increment it, the write time once per second for up to 240 seconds. And if it's not, if the file size is the same 1 second, if it's the same whenever I check it and then 1 second later, well, then Flogger's not writing to it anymore. And in that case, I'm going to assume that it's done writing. And here I do just some formatting to get the file size in human readable format, because I don't like counting kilobytes. And then I echo these things, and these echoes it's going to be the formatted size, and it's going to tell me how long it took to write it. And that's all going to go to this file that I specified in the header, temp logger write time. If you wanted it to be permanent, you probably shouldn't put it in temp. I was doing this temporarily, so I did. And so because I used these double carets, it's not going to overwrite the file. This means if I was running this, if I was calling this script from a GP test after I set the stop log event, which is what I would want to do, I would want to set the stop log event, and then I would want to run this script and wait for it to return, or wait for it to exit. And actually, if I'm doing it from GP test, let me just go ahead and say you would probably want to do like an exit 7 as opposed to just a break. And then you could call it with auxiliary task, and auxiliary task would know how to, or maybe I guess it would be exit 0. You would want to handle the exit status. I would need to open GP template to remember what you need to exit. But the idea here is you would want to use something like this call it, and then wait until the Flogger file's done before you try to actually read in the Flogger data file and do something with it. So yeah, this is just another bash script example. It's mostly bash commands, not CyFlex commands, but it's very much related to doing things with CyFlex. So I thought this was also a noteworthy mention for this general topic. So again, I guess if you have any questions, or if you think that any of this is a terrible idea or overly complex because you're solving the same problem in a better way, leave a comment, and hopefully someone else will use your idea, not mine. Alrighty, thanks everyone.